Anyone reading Mark's Gospel can't help but realise that Mark puts a huge amount of emphasis on Jesus' conflict with authority. Sometimes Jesus' conflict is with the spiritual authorities that oppress and tyrannise humanity. So we see Jesus casting out the evil spirits. We see Jesus raising people from the dead. But we also see Jesus in conflict with earthly authorities, with the religious authorities of his day. And perhaps most prominent within Mark's Gospel is Jesus' conflict with a group of people that were known as the Pharisees. Who were the Pharisees? Well, the Pharisees were Jews that belonged to a movement within Judaism called Pharisaism. And the Pharisees believed that if they could call the Jewish people back to holding the law of God in high regard, then perhaps God would forgive the Jewish nation of their wrongdoing and would bring an end to Roman oppression. We have an idea of what was important to the Pharisees when we read further on in the New Testament. We find there the writings of the Apostle Paul, who before he became a Christian was a Pharisee. And Paul talks about his Pharisaism in terms of his zeal. He said, I was zealous for the law. I was zealous for the traditions of my forefathers. That word zealous is an interesting one. It speaks of a fervent commitment to a cause. It speaks of a passion that is overwhelming, that takes over everything else. And Paul is saying that in my younger years, before I was a Christian, I was fervently committed to calling the Jewish nation back to its allegiance to the law of God. Now, Jesus wouldn't have had any problem with that in and of itself. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus actually says, I have not come to abolish the law. I've not come to do away with God's law. It's sometimes a misconception that people have, that Jesus' conflict with the authorities amounted to the religious authorities wanting to live life according to the law of God, and Jesus saying, no, you don't need the law anymore. That's not what Jesus was saying. Jesus' problem wasn't with the law. Jesus' problem was with all the traditions that had built up around the law, the traditions that the Pharisees believed being of great importance. Let me give you a couple of examples. The law of God said that people weren't permitted to work on the Sabbath. In the Ten Commandments, we read, 6 days you shall labour, and on the seventh day you shall rest. The reason is that God himself rested from his labour on the seventh day. So the Pharisees and the scribes that had a lot to do with them started asking themselves the question, well, what is labour? What counts as work on the Sabbath? What kind of work is forbidden and what kind of work is permitted? They would say things like, well, tying a knot on the Sabbath constitutes work, so that would be forbidden. But surely some kinds of knots would be permitted, so they formulated the rule that any knot that can be tied or untied with one hand was perfectly permissible. Or here's another example. It would say if your house caught fire on the Sabbath, if you were to pick up your clothes and carry them out of the house, then that would count as labour. That would be work, and work is forbidden on the Sabbath. So you mustn't do that. But they said, if you put all your clothes on first, so you're wearing your clothes, well, that's perfectly permissible. You can then leave the house with your clothes. And it's this sort of approach to the law, of building up all of these traditions and all these rules and regulations around the law that Jesus had a problem with. Let's now concern ourselves with some of the narratives in Mark's Gospel where Jesus is in conflict with the religious authorities. You could say that the scene is set as early as Mark chapter 2, where some members of the religious establishment hear Jesus claim that he has authority on earth to forgive sins. And they start muttering among themselves, saying, "Who has authority to forgive sins but God alone? This man is a blasphemer." Later, in Mark chapter 2, we read of Jesus taking his disciples through a field, and some of them pick some corn. We can picture them perhaps rubbing the corn in their hands and eating it. And as far as the Pharisees were concerned, the disciples were doing this on the Sabbath. And this was labour and therefore forbidden in their eyes. And so they challenged Jesus. "Why are you letting your disciples do work on the Sabbath?" And Jesus makes the point that in the Old Testament, the greatest of all the Old Testament kings, King David himself, ate bread that was consecrated, bread that had been set aside for God. He broke that rule because of the need that he had and the need in the lives of his own men. And Jesus was saying, look, these rules and these regulations that you say we need to live our lives by should never take precedence over human need. If people are hungry, then they should be permitted to eat, whether it's the Sabbath or whether it isn't the Sabbath. And then he says this, "For the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." In other words, it's not the rules and the regulations that come first. God instituted the Sabbath law for the blessing of humanity, that we might flourish, that we might know fullness of life, that we might know health, that we might have well-being in our souls, because God knows that he's wired us in a way that we need to rest. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, for our blessing, not man for the Sabbath. We don't build up all these rules and regulations and impose them on people so that people feel that they have to slavishly follow all of these rules and regulations in order to please God. A bit later in Mark's Gospel, the next chapter in fact, Mark chapter 3, we read about Jesus in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And there's a man there with a withered or a shriveled hand. And members of the religious establishment are looking at Jesus keenly to see if he will dare to heal this man on the Sabbath. Perhaps they've planted this man in the congregation to test Jesus this way. And Jesus looks at this man with compassion. And he looks at the Pharisees with anger. It's actually the only time in the Gospels that we're specifically told that Jesus experienced the emotion of anger. But he's angry with these people. He's angry that they would put their rules and their regulations, their own traditions, over and above a man who is in need. And Jesus reaches out to this man, and in compassion he heals them. The Pharisees are furious. We read that they go away and they start plotting with the supporters of Herod how they might kill Jesus. They're furious because Jesus breaks this rule. But the issue is not whether or not it's permissible to work on the Sabbath. The whole conflict is centered around the issue of what kind of work it is or isn't appropriate to do on the Sabbath. As far as Jesus is concerned, if there is a need that can be met, then that need should be met. You should reach out to that person with compassion. And whether it's the Sabbath or whether it's another day is immaterial. As far as Jesus is concerned, God has not instituted the law that people might slavishly obey its commands and in so doing have a quality of life that is detrimental to their well-being. Let's fast forward a little bit through Mark's Gospel into Mark chapter 7. There we have an extended dialogue between Jesus and the Pharisees. And it begins with the Pharisees accusing Jesus of allowing his disciples to eat food before they've gone through a cleansing ritual. The Pharisees believed that every Jew should engage in a process of ritual or ceremonial cleansing before they picked up food and started to eat it. And Jesus didn't insist that his disciples did that. So they accused Jesus of having this cavalier attitude to the law of God. Of course, this isn't an aspect of God's holy law. This is one of the many traditions that has grown up around the law of God. This is one example of the many rules and regulations that had built up around God's holy law. And here, the nature of the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees has to do with the concept of holiness. What is it that marks someone out as being holy, and therefore someone who is doing what is right in the eyes of God? As far as the Pharisees were concerned, what marked you out as being holy and in the right with God was certain practices that you did, certain rituals that you followed, certain traditions that you went along with. And Jesus said, no, that is irrelevant. Holiness has to do with the state of a person's heart. He uses this illustration. He says, what goes into the body doesn't make a person unclean. It's what comes out of the person, out of a person's heart, that makes them unclean. Jesus is saying external rules and rituals, external practices and behaviours, the religious things that people do aren't the things that make them holy, aren't the things that put them in the right in God's eyes. Rather, it's the state of their heart. What's going on in the inner man or woman that really counts in the sight of God? Mark actually says something astonishing at this point. He says that as far as Jesus was concerned, it didn't matter what you ate and what you drank. What goes into the body counts for nothing. It's what comes out of the heart, the expression of the heart of the person that really counts in God's eyes. And of course, this would have been an extraordinary thing to say in a Jewish context. For the Jews believed that there were certain things that the law of God forbade them to eat. And Mark is saying it wasn't like that for Jesus. Jesus followed the law of God, but Jesus wasn't a slave to the law of God. Jesus didn't buy into the lie that by following these rules and regulations, you were somehow all right in God's sight. As far as Jesus was concerned, it was what was going on in the inside of a person that really counted. And it was what was going on the inside of a person that was the truest mark of whether they were really a part of God's kingdom or not.